Hey friends, I have to give you a warning first. I'm going to be talking about breasts, but I'm consciously refraining from showing any photos of breasts. The closest I'll come to showing a boob is a short clip of Jordan Peterson. So if you're here for prurient reasons, you might as well stop right now. Don't expect to be titillated. I'm going to be dry and pedantic and academic. So sorry, not sorry. This is, however, a significant and valid question, and one that arises legitimately from a comparative approach. Other female primates have small, non protuberant breasts, so it's a noticeable difference that human females have this prominent secondary sexual characteristic. It's distinctive to our species, and it's certainly a product of evolution. So, why? I'm going to go through several hypotheses, but first I have to bring up an important caveat to the question. Breast sizes are highly variable. Not all women have large breasts, and furthermore, small breasts are demonstrably not a problem for lactation or reproduction. The enlargement is of fatty tissue, not glandular tissue, and further, breast size is variable and its relevance is a sexual cue. You may think the Western obsession with large breasts is entirely justifiable as a biological response, but it's not. Other cultures place little emphasis on breasts as a sexual stimulus. The sexual role of breasts is, and don't cry, sexists, a culturally determined response. It is a variable, socially constructed response to a variable, biologically determined stimulus, which means we're delving into the complex territory of interactions between environment and genetics. The variability is a significant factor upon which many of the hypotheses are going to founder. If you're going to argue that breast size has been selected for, you either have to show that small breasted women have or have had a reduced fitness, or that there are trade offs with other factors that can favor a variable distribution. You also have to do the hard work of actually gathering observational evidence and assessing correlations. You don't get to do experimental work on humans. And another of the failings of many of these hypotheses is that the evidence just isn't there. And another major problem many of these hypotheses have is that they fail to address another dimension. Why does your hypothetical advantage only apply to women? You have to explain why your explanation applies to only half the human population. Okay, so let's get into it. I'm going to discuss 5 different hypotheses. This is not an exhaustive list, since many of these really are nothing but just so stories, which are limited only by your imagination. But these are the primary proposals I've read about. The first one, and the most ludicrous, is the buttock substitute hypothesis. It's extremely popular. It's been around since the 1960s at least. Another is the nipple mobility hypothesis, which is creative, and I kind of appreciate this one, and you'll see why. The honest signaling hypothesis is sort of a general idea. It's the idea that it's a way to signal to other members of your culture that you are really strong if you can carry around excess baggage. There is the sexual maturity hypothesis, which suggests that what we have here is not an indicator necessarily of just sex, but of sexual age. Are you capable of sexual intercourse? Are you capable of reproducing? And finally, the hypothesis I tend to favor, the byproduct hypothesis, and we'll get into that in a moment. Let's talk first about the buttock substitute hypothesis. I can't believe I have to discuss this one because it is so ridiculous. If you're a biologist, it should only provoke laughter, but unfortunately, it is amazingly popular with the general population, keeps getting brought up by the media and evolutionary psychologists and other cranks. The idea here is that other primates mainly copulate with the male entering the female for the rear, and in some species, the female exhibits prominent, even colorful swellings when she is receptive. So far, so good. Humans, when they became bipedal, often copulate face to face. So, they required a ventral signal for sexual receptivity. This is where we're getting onto shaky ground. Thus, the argument goes, evolution conveniently provided a butt substitute on the front of the chest. There are more than a few problems with this idea. It completely ignores the variability issue. Do flat-chested women have difficulty arousing men in the bedroom? Are men unable to perform without proxy buttocks? Also, breasts are not sexual signals in many cultures. It is bizarre to assume that a peculiar Western obsession is a human universal, or that it was a universal in human evolution. And, I don't know about you, but really I'm not fooled. Breasts and butts actually look significantly different. It's one thing to propose that humans evolved novel sexual triggers. So, yes, sure, maybe breasts are a new sexual trigger. But it's another to claim that diverse primate signals are displaced in humans and that we are somehow tricked in our perception to think that breasts are a focus for intercourse. Another difference between humans and other primates is that we don't have a cycle of estrus. Human females are potentially always sexually responsive. So, why did we need to evolve a receptivity signal? The biological open for business signal is always open. It's the social and personal signals that are variable. But really, the biggest problem with this hypothesis is that there's no evidence at all. The logic is that I, a man, find women's bodies sexually attractive. Therefore, evolution must have shaped women to fit my desires. And that ultimately is why this wild ass guess is so popular. I should have called it the universe serves male gratification hypothesis. So, where did it come from? There are many men who accept this kind of nonsense as fact. They assume women are like these non autonomous objects whose entire history is one of being sculpted biologically to serve men's needs. This idea came straight from Desmond Morris in his very popular book, The Naked Ape. The answer stands out clearly as the female bosom itself, he says. And right away, you should see a problem. He's merely stating, this is so obvious that I don't need to give evidence. But no, you still need to present some evidence for this. He goes on, the protuberant hemispherical breasts of the female must surely be copies of the fleshy buttocks. And the sharply defined red lips around the mouth must be copies of the red labia. Must, huh? Okay, again, you can't simply say it must be so. You have to show me why you think it is so. And Morris always failed at doing that. It was a bad idea when it was first published, but it was controversial and attention-getting. So many reviews of The Naked Ape mentioned this observation. It was published when I was 10 years old, and when I read it as a teenager, I noticed and marveled at this particular observation. And I assumed, since it was stated with such absolute certainty, that it must be true. Apparently, you can say total balderdash, but if you say it with confidence that brooks no questions, you'll always find someone gullible enough to accept it, especially if they're a 13-year-old boy. But nope, sorry, there's no evidence for Morris's claim. These aren't even logically sound arguments. This is pure just-so storytelling. It's also an appeal to adaptationist thinking, as so many of these hypotheses are, drawing on the satisfaction of a causal explanation, especially one that draws on the appeal of male gratification. This next hypothesis is also an adaptationist just-so story, but at least it doesn't regard women as evolving to fit male sexual desires. I actually like this one a little bit. It breaks away from the usual male-centered idea. The hypothesis is that humans, when they became bipedal, also acquired a new flexibility in carrying things with their arms that were now liberated from the task of locomotion. Among the things they could carry in new ways were babies. Babies that may need to nurse while you're walking along, or when you're sitting around a hearth, or when you're doing your other work around the home. In other primates, the nipple is located in a fixed position on a flat chest. In humans, it can be moved around more, allowing more degrees of freedom in holding a baby. I think that's interesting. The hypothesis has a few positive. It explains the sexual dimorphism, since men don't lactate. And it assumes that female morphology evolved to benefit women, not men. But it also has some negatives. As I will continue to harp upon, it does not explain the variability within women. Variation is data. Don't ignore it. Studies of hunter-gatherer societies tend to show that all members of the culture tend to have very low body fat, and that in fact, maintaining a low body fat while lactating is a useful physiological trait for regulating fertility. The women striding across the savannah with a baby on their hip would have been lean and relatively flat-chested. But the big problem with this one is, once again, the lack of evidence. It is a purely speculative hypothesis. Some speculation is always good if it leads to observations and experiment. The author of this idea was Elaine Morgan of aquatic ape fame. And while I like that she was good at thinking outside the box, there was no follow-through. There was no gathering of evidence or experimental testing. And ultimately, its appeal lies in the fact that it treats women as autonomous agents in their own history, which is good, but not in any science, which is bad. Here's another idea with a reasonably sound foundation. Large fat deposits are expensive and require a lot of energy to accumulate. It's an expression of the handicap principle. If a woman has large breasts, she must be strong, well-fed, and relatively free of parasites, and therefore flaunting heavy fatty organs is an unambiguous signal of health and nutrition, and therefore she would be a good choice for a mate. Up to a point, this is certainly a reasonable idea. To some degree, we do judge prospective mates on their health and appearance. Young, healthy, and fertile are selectable characteristics, and they represent a suite of traits with sex appeal to modern humans. So why not in our ancestors as well? A few flaws, though. As always, explain the variability, please. Why aren't slender women rejected by men more? They're clearly carrying a draining load of parasites, or have been unable to feed themselves, or are wasting away from disease. It also doesn't explain sexual dimorphism. It assumes that males are the selective force for traits in females, but it ought to go both ways. Wouldn't it be an honest signal of strength and skill in food gathering if males sported a pair of large breasts? The bigger the better. Okay, and why breasts? Gentlemen, if you find fatty growths attractive as an indicator of health, would you feel likewise about gigantic bellies or huge thighs? The transition would have been awkward. Would it have been seen as healthy when an ancient ancestor sprouted unusual bulges in places no previous ape would have considered normal? But really, men and women have different distributions of body fat. Do women find pot bellies as sexually attractive as men find large breasts? We keep telling ourselves that they do. Okay, so I would not rule out this hypothesis as a factor, but it does fail to explain specifically why breasts? Why not some other organ? All right, here's another idea that's kind of male-centered. This is the idea that breasts are basically a visible meter to allow men to judge the sexual maturity of the female. You can easily assess whether a female is prepubertal and therefore infertile. And the breast shape changes also allow one to see at a glance when a female is old and post-reproductive. Notice that once again we're in a male-centered domain. Men are judging, women are being passively judged. No one ever seems to consider that it is to the woman's selective advantage to exercise control over reproduction. So why are we assuming it is evolutionarily favored for her to advertise? We hypothesize about women evolving cryptic ovulation to hide their fertility, but at the same time we argue that males were selecting females for visible fertility signals. And I'll say it again, we're ignoring the variability. Are women with small breasts bad at advertising their sexual maturity? Then there's the flip side. There's variability in the male response. Creepy as it is, there are men who are attracted to small childlike bodies, where small breasts are an indicator of youth. What is being signaled? How is it being received? We're in a world of mixed messages here, which could in part be one of the reasons there is so much variability, but it also means we lack consistent context to explain the origin of the phenomenon. Unlike other hypotheses, this one does have some observations to back it up. The age of first menstruation is inversely correlated with the amount of body fat. That is, women reach reproductive maturity earlier when living on a rich diet and having high body fat indices. And conversely, low body fat, as is seen in athletes, for instance, is correlated with menstrual irregularities. Those hunter gatherers I mentioned earlier, they have low fat diets, are walking for many miles every day, and are simultaneously lactating, and may not ovulate at all for years at a time. But note, please, this does not address the origin of breasts specifically. It's about the endocrine effects of subcutaneous body fat, wherever it may be, or the ratio of fat to lean body mass. I'd give this hypothesis a bit of a shrug. It's true, there are physiological changes of the human body with development and age, so in that sense, it's a valid but trivial explanation, lacking in specificity. I save my preferred explanation for last. Breasts are simply a product of an initial chance distribution of subcutaneous fat, possibly followed by sexual selection for male versus female markers. This is basically the null hypothesis. What does that mean? We know there are sex differences in the distribution of fat, just as there are sex differences in the distribution of hair. These are arbitrary. That is, there is no specific functional reason why females tend to accumulate subcutaneous fat in the thighs, while males accumulate it in the belly. It probably involves localization of, for instance, steroid receptors during development. It really has no significant effect on survival or behavior, and variations in genes affecting that distribution can accumulate in the population, leading to the variation we see now. So the first cause for breasts, pure chance. An intelligent primate species could just as well have evolved that had fatty deposits on male chests while females grew beards. Evolution does not care. However, humans care a great deal about sex. Once these differences emerged, human brains would become finely tuned to perceive differences between sexes. We know that people are exquisitely sensitive to even the most delicate differences between males and females. We are amazingly good at picking up on tiny variations in faces, for instance. Female eyebrows are on average infinitesimally higher and more arched than those of males, creating an illusion of larger eyes. Male noses are slightly larger on average than those of females. Female jaws are less robust than those of males, and they have smaller chins. We can pick up on those tiny differences, and larger differences like width of the hips and differences in gait are even easier to see. And yes, shape of the chest is another obvious marker. Again, all those differences are on average, and it's the totality of the whole that we unconsciously assess to recognize male versus female bodies. Or, more accurately, we're really good at recognizing the outcomes of the human body's responses to different hormone regimes. These are all human bodies, after all. No one sex is the standard for the species, and evolution happens to all sexes simultaneously, so your perspective on the evolution of sex-specific attributes shouldn't be seen only through the lens of males versus females. There has to be a lot of coevolution going on. If there's evolution of larger breasts in response to estrogen, there also has to be simultaneous evolution of favored responses to larger breasts by brains conditioned by testosterone, or more likely, by cultural influences. I have to emphasize, though, that there is no good evidence that a breast size is correlated at all with fertility or reproductive success, and there is, in fact, good evidence that breast size is totally irrelevant to parenting. We do not have evidence of sexual selection for this attribute, and it may be an entirely, completely, from the very beginning, chance feature of differential hormone responses. And it really is, at its root, an arbitrary expansion of a chance distinction in our physiology. For another example of how it could have gone, let's look at the proboscis monkey. Male and female proboscis monkeys have large noses, but they're immense in the male. The most likely explanation is sexual selection, that females favored males with large honkers, perhaps because of the greater resonance of their mating calls, and from that initial chance variation, sexual selection has led to this result. Imagine if, in the early human rootstock 150,000 years ago, estrogen tended to produce slightly larger noses rather than slightly larger breasts, and that males had cued into that difference, and we found large noses to be a signifier of female beauty rather than large breasts. We could have ended up with a species in which this photo was pure pornography, very sexy, and we'd be kind of grossed out by species with pendulous fat bags on their chests. We'd also be trying to find a way to argue that large noses are naturally and biologically favored in some functional way. It's a common phenomenon in which we try to justify some biological attribute as the best solution, an indicator that we live in the best of all possible worlds, and we assume that all properties of our behavior and structure are righteously optimized. We also tend to personalize evolution in inappropriate ways. Think back to that Desmond Morris quote, which is all about his biases. Well, I find breasts sexually stimulating, and therefore evolution must have generated them hundreds of thousands of years ago to make me happy today. Just as proboscis monkeys would assume gigantic noses are nature's way of sexually stimulating her. The outcome is not intrinsically valuable, and we commit the fallacy of retrospective coronation when we assume its effect now tells us about its origin. That only leads to ludicrous conclusions. Speaking of ludicrous conclusions, here is another example of a fallacious interpretation. It's from that infamous interview of Jordan Peterson with Vice.
Like what? Here's a rule.
Don't
How about no makeup in the workplace?
Why would that be a rule?
Why should you wear makeup in the workplace? Isn't that sexually provocative?
No.
It's not?
No.
Well, what is it then? What's the purpose of makeup?
Some people would like to just put on makeup.
Why?
I don't know why.
Why do you make your lips red? Because they turn red during sexual arousal. That's why. Why do you put rouge on your cheeks? Same reason.
I mean, look.
How about high heels?
What are they
for?
about high heels?
What about them? They're there to exaggerate sexual attractiveness. That's what high heels do. Now, I'm not saying that people shouldn't use sexual displays in the workplace. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that that is what they're doing. And that is what they're doing.
There is so much wrong with so much of this interview, and I'm only picking on this one tiny part. But here are a few difficulties. Red is a popular lipstick color, okay, but how does he explain these other colors, which can also be quite attractive? What about the implicit racism in that claim? It's a white trait to have a greater contrast in color between the lip and the face. What about the men? We should always ask that. What about the men? Why do men have a vulva mimic between our nose and our chin? And where is Peterson's evidence? This is another example of the Desmond Morris effect. He simply asserts that his interpretation is the obvious one, therefore it must be true. Allow me to offer a better alternative explanation. Women are not putting on makeup in order to invite random men to have sex with them. That's the explanation of a sociopath, someone who can't empathize with another human being. Women are putting on makeup in order to conform to culturally defined standards of attractiveness. Often this involves accentuating attributes associated with femininity. Under the influence of estrogen, human bodies develop fuller lips, so additional color is used to exaggerate female features. They are simply announcing, I am a woman and I look good. That is not synonymous with announcing, I am a sex object. It's about taking pride in one's appearance, making an effort to conform with society's expectations, and about identifying with a group. Peterson is doing exactly the same thing by refusing to wear makeup and having a conventionally male hairstyle. He's taking a position on how men ought to look and conforming to social pressures. Maybe we should break that down by having a social convention that everyone in the workplace ought to take enough concern in their appearance that they put on at least a little lip gloss and some eyeshadow to make themselves presentable, maybe a nice dress. How can you be professional if you don't do that? What's surprising about Peterson's assertion is that this is the same fellow who famously offers the basic advice that men ought to stand up straight and throw their shoulders back, that they ought to take responsibility for their appearance and their lives and clean up their room. Yet he fails to notice that while society allows considerable male slovenliness, women are under greater pressure to make more concern with their appearance, that they're expected to show up at work or in public with nice clothing and appropriate makeup, and he mistakes that for posing for sex. The bottom line is that there are biological sex differences, and we do not deny them. But we also do not consider sex to be the only role for women in society. And we reject Peterson's pseudoscientific rationalizations to compel rigid sexual identities on everyone. Walking around with breasts or lips is not advertising one's availability for sex. And it's demeaning when someone uses an expression of self-respect and appreciation of one's identity as instead a statement about sexual submission. That's an interpretation that is entirely in Peterson's head, and he should be working to change it rather than trying to indoctrinate more people to accept his faulty perceptions. So in conclusion, what are breasts for? They're just arbitrary biological features. As with any biological feature, you should feel free to take pride in it, to express it, to not be ashamed of the fact that you have this. It is not an indicator that you are a sexual object. Talk to you later.